Welcome to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Laurie James. Laurie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh my God, Jen, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I am so excited you're here too. And I would love for you to start with how did you get into writing?
Well, that's a great question because I never identified myself as a writer ever. And English was definitely not my strongest subject in high school or in college. So I like to say that my book found me during a very tumultuous time in my life when I was raising four teenage daughters. My mother suddenly fell ill, and about a year into that, my marriage became very strained. Also, during this 8-year period of time in my life, I was managing I found caregivers that were drinking on the job, stealing from me, emotionally seducing my dad. I
Gosh.
even had one caregiver who basically told me it was time for my mother to die, and she had stopped giving my mom some medication. So I would come home to my husband and my girlfriends and laugh and cry in my glass of wine. And everybody kept saying, you have to write this stuff down because you can't make this stuff up. And I was like, I don't have time to write this stuff down. I'm barely surviving this period. So fast forward a few more years, maybe about 3, 4 years, things were more settled. My kids were starting to cycle out of the house and into college. And I sat at a yoga retreat and was talking to a fellow writer. And she said, just go write your first scene right now. And so I did. And that was the beginning of my writing journey. It took me 5 years to finish my book from beginning to end. And I definitely had to, I wasn't a writer, like outside of writing an email to negotiate, carpool, being a stay-at-home mom. So I took classes. I took classes at UCLA and then found this really wonderful program up in the Bay Area. And then eventually, when I got to the point, I found a wonderful editor who helped me finish things off. So that's my writing journey in a nutshell.
Wow. I mean, my
Yeah.
goodness. And I can understand why uh, you weren't ready to write when it was going on, because to me, especially when you're writing memoir, you want to write when it's a scar. When
Yes.
not when the wound has opened, not when the wound is trying to heal. You might write pieces of it when it's healing, but that's for your consumption. That's for your processing, more like a journal or a diary. But
Yeah.
but to turn that into something that you want to take further in the form of a book, that needs to be more of a scar. And even if you use those pieces to help you remember something, or you wrote it down and you want to include it, there's still now some distance between when that happened and that processing to discern when to include, what not to include, how
Right.
much, or what have you. So I love that it wasn't something you did immediately, as well as that it took time to write. I think
Hmm.
it's really cool that it took several years to write, because
Yeah.
that probably helped you in a lot of ways.
Well, the whole writing experience was extremely cathartic for me because it's a memoir and because it was happening to me. But what's interesting about what you just said is there were parts that I did write that there was a scar, and there were other, because as I started writing my book, and by the time I finished my book, I was still living what was happening. And there were let's just say my first draft, there was a lot of anger in it.
Understandable.
And I had to go back and tone some of that down. And I toned it down mostly because I wanted the reader to make their own conclusions about what was going on and the various players that were involved in my life at that time.
I agree with that. That to your point, I totally appreciate that the first draft and maybe even into the second was the emotion that needed to come out because it was
Mhm.
also you finding your voice, you finding your
Completely.
voice for you as a writer to say, what do I want to say or not say? So the fact that you recognized and said, okay, this might feel a little strong. How did you go back through and say and choose what to include or where to tone down or where to say, I needed to write it then, but I don't need to include it
Mhm.
now?
So that's a really wonderful question too, because it was interesting. I think time definitely gave me that space to release and work through some of my anger because I was in therapy at the time. I was on the personal spiritual quest. I think I still am. I think that's a journey, not a destination. But I would go back and I would read a chapter because once I finished my first draft, which by the way had a very different ending than the ending that I ended up with. Because as a side note, my first ending, when I finished it, I said, this is not my story. This is not my complete story. And so, but when I went back, even to just figure out what my story and my ending was, which I knew in my heart what it was, but I had to develop the strength and the courage to make a very big life change, a big life decision, which takes a lot of courage. But going back to your original question, as I would go back, I would read what I originally wrote. I'm like, ooh, she's a little angry. I'm like, okay, how do I tone this down? And the other thing too is I had a really wonderful writing coach that I was working with for a period of time. I took courses, but I was assigned a coach, and that having that that sounding board was really important. I think having, whether you hire a coach, a writing coach, or if you just have a writing partner who you trust. But it's also super important to be open to that feedback, because oftentimes writers, they're like, nope, this is my story and this is the way I want to write it. And sometimes just having somebody else's perspective who has usually written memoir or written many books and have had many, experience editing and coaching other writers. So I stayed very open. I didn't accept all of her suggestions and changes, but I took a lot of what she said to heart. And I think for me, because I was writing memoir and because I was going through this very difficult time in my life, as in my book, my one my coach was also a therapist. So I think that was very beneficial for me. So that goes to the point of also making sure whoever you find or whoever you hire is a really wonderful fit for you. And it's different for everybody. I think that's really key.
Oh, absolutely. I love that you said that because
Yeah.
you said a few things here that I think are really important in the sense that one, to your point, you didn't take all the feedback into the manuscript to make the changes, but yet you process them to say, is this right for me to include? And then choose yes or no and how to do so. Because even if it's like, I get it, I feel like you're on the right track, or I get that I need to change this. I'm on board with making the change, but I don't know if it's even this way. Maybe it's a whole nother way, but I needed to have somebody say, let's look at this and with a whole nother perspective. What do you
Right.
think about? But the other is that, to your point about finding the right fit, and it's okay to talk to several coaches or several editors to get the right fit for you, because
Yes.
it's one thing to also click in an interview, but like
Mhm.
even with the editor standpoint, it's one thing to click on a conversation, but can you receive the feedback from that person in the way
Mhm.
they deliver it? It might be,
Mhm.
oh, we click great, but I can't handle the feedback, even if it's the exact same thing that this other person would say, but person B says it slightly differently, and I can
Mhm.
handle the way person B says it.
Right.
Great, then do so.
Right. Yeah, that's real key. Because yeah, that's going to make or break your book, I believe.
So, how did you know? Because a lot of what I'm hearing that you're talking about is really not just finding your voice with writing, but trusting that voice, trusting that little voice inside that will sit
Mhm.
there and say, hey, are we showing too much anger here? Maybe we should tone
Mhm.
it down. Or, hey, we're not done with this story yet. We need more time, or we need to
Mhm.
keep working through to get to the real ending. This is
Mhm.
only the ending of a chapter, maybe not the ending of the book. Or is this the right coach or editor for me? You really are, to me, touching on trusting that inner voice. Do you have some suggestions for writers who would really benefit from, like, maybe they are feeling like they're getting too much noise coming at them from
Yeah.
different angles, and then how do they just sit through and listen to that voice and find it?
I think the biggest suggestion I could make is to get quiet with yourself. Right. I'm a meditator, I'm a yogi, and I think, and even if you're not a meditator, go for a long walk with yourself, nobody else, and don't have music on, don't listen to a podcast. If you're uncertain, and give yourself that space. Everybody's different, but whatever works for you as a writer, allow yourself to have that space to be quiet with yourself and to see what comes up, because that's when our gut and our intuition comes up. And I did this too. I did this far too long. I was looking for other people to either validate a decision or validate me on what I should do. It didn't matter if it was my husband or friends. I was looking for somebody else to really, in some instances, make my decision for me. And and the thing is, we all know what's right for ourselves if we allow ourselves to listen, because I'm different than you and you're different than your next interviewee or the next person you talk to at Starbucks. I mean, we're all different. And it's so important. We are the only ones that know what's right for us. So, for instance, just going back to the writing process and touching a little bit on our previous conversation, my writing coach, I can't even remember the exact scene, but there was one scene she was like, just take this out. This is not important. It's too much. And I just felt like I just needed to say it. Right. And I took this whole scene and I basically said it in 2 sentences, but it was important for me to put that in because I felt like it was an important piece to specifically that chapter and what was happening in my life at that time. So even, again, whether it's a coach or somebody else, you have to really get quiet, give yourself the space and the time and really listen to your own inner guide or your intuition.
I love that. And that takes courage to be able to
It
not
does.
just listen, but to take action upon it, because it might feel counterintuitive, but yet it's the right thing. It's the thing that
Mhm.
you feel the peace around, even when there's noise sitting there going, are you kidding? But there's a
Right.
peace inside that says, it's okay. You
Yeah.
can do this. And
Yeah.
and it can be something as simple as the title of this book was one thing and now it's something else. Or to your point,
Mhm.
this whole scene, maybe the scene doesn't need to, but something about it, even distilling it to the 2 sentences,
Mhm.
was honoring that. And that took courage to do that.
Mhm.
I love
Mhm.
that you did that. So with Sandwich, which I love that name so much.
Thank you.
I love that so, so much. What was it like as you were, so you getting this writing going, you have this, you've got the coach, you've been working through the writing, you've got the first draft, you've even got maybe a few more drafts under your belt. So was Sandwich the first title that you came up with? And if not, what made you change it?
So that, yeah, it was actually not the first title. When I first started writing, I was focusing on the caregiver issues that I referenced earlier. And so I called it the Caregiver Chronicles, kind of like the Nanny Diaries, because I was struggling with finding good care for my mom, and more my mom than my dad at the time. and but as I started writing, and after I wrote that first, well, it was really, I would say maybe 3/4 of the way into that first draft, I was like, oh no, this is not about the Caregiver Chronicles. This is about me being sandwiched and the sandwich generation, which is many, many people deal with, and even probably more so now after this pandemic. And so I immediately, like, I want to say within a day of me coming up with that, I was like, okay, I'm the URL, got it, sandwich, a memoir. I just like bought everything I could because I just knew that that was the title. And when I got to the publishing decision, I was praying that they weren't going to want to change the title. Unfortunately, that was not an issue. They helped me with the subtitle, but yeah, I just intuitively knew at that point that that was going to be the title of my book.
Talk about the subtitle though. How did that take shape? Because not every book needs a subtitle, but
Right.
sometimes that's the very thing that just amplifies the title or the overall messaging. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the subtitle is A Memoir of Holding On and Letting Go. And that really depicts, and I did not like that subtitle. And I pushed back on it. But as I was communicating with the editor of my publishing company, we worked through it. And, I just, again, gave myself some space and took some time to think about it. And I let it kind of sink in. And then I thought, you know what? And, we kind of went back and forth and communicated through email about, well, this is why I think it and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, she's right. Because it's really, my story was about holding on and letting go of many things. And for an example, my mom had dementia for 12 years. She passed away April of 2020, but she was on hospice twice. So there were times when I was prepared to let her go, and then she came back. And then I was prepared to let her go, and she came back.
Oh.
Right. Holding on and letting go of various contention points in my marriage of, is my marriage going to work and is it not? Is my marriage going to work and is not? And you have to read the book to find out. And also letting go of my kids, letting them leave the nest, letting, like holding on to them. Are they ready to leave? And then letting them go. So, but thank you for asking that, because that's a really great question. So, but it didn't resonate with me at the beginning, but now it's like, yeah, it was the perfect subtitle.
I love the subtitle. And I think that what it does is that it just further drives home the intention, because the title is catchy. The title is like, that's interesting. But the subtitle really helps to just kind of create a picture that says, I get that. And what I hear you really unpacking in your book for yourself, but really for your reader too. Your reader can see themselves in your book by recognizing that even if they haven't gone through the very things that you have, or even if maybe they're not even in the sandwich generation or a part of that yet, there's elements of grief. There's joy, because even when there is a chapter closing, when there's a new chapter starting, but that transition space can feel kind of icky and scary. And when is
and
that
hard
next? Yes,
and painful and
yes,
sad.
yes, yes. And in the same breath, you are showing them through your book, through your stories, through your title, that what's possible for them too, but they're walking along the journey with you. So how did you keep your reader in mind as you were kind of writing your book, yet holding their hand as they're going, that they're reading and processing potentially their own grief too?
Yeah. And this is where I think a really good coach comes in is I really made an effort, and I shouldn't say we together, when I got to the point where I was ready to hire somebody, and it was probably around my, I don't know, maybe third edit, out of, I don't know, 7, 8, who knows how many actually you go through, but I lost count at some point. But it's really writing a universal message, writing a universal story. And my universal story is about, there were, for a variety of reasons, I had felt very lonely for much of my life. And once I realized what the root of that was, which related a lot to my childhood and some things that happened in my childhood, and also the fact that I'm adopted. So I think it's really important as you're writing a book is to think about your demographic and to write a universal story. And so mine was, so many people feel so alone, even though they have a big family. I have 4 daughters and a husband, but it's like, but yet I'm very alone. And so for me, I wanted to try and connect with my readers and make them feel less alone. Like, you're not the only one that's going through change, right? And it doesn't matter. It could be, a divorce. It could be your kids leaving the nest. It could be changing careers. There's so much. Anytime we transition through life, there's a death and a rebirth. And there's going to be grieving in that process. There's going to be sadness through that process. But we have to grieve that death in order to birth something new. And, there was a lot that I had to grieve, but I birthed this beautiful book. I birthed a coaching practice, and it wasn't easy. It was probably one of the hardest things I ever did. But for those who are struggling with that, it's worth it. It's totally worth it, because I am such a happier person. And I don't have that loneliness. I had developing the strength and courage to make the changes I needed, and allowing what was already dying to die allowed me to just birth a new life in so many ways.
That is powerful, and that is beautiful and courageous.
Thank you.
And even if, from a writer, if maybe you're working on a project and maybe this story just, something's not working, you keep coming back to it, no matter how many times you try to keep working it, and you realize maybe it's not, this isn't the story, or maybe I need to switch gears and write something else because this is not I'm not resonating with this anymore. Just like you said, it's okay.
That's information.
Yes, it's information. Thank you for letting me know. Thank you for helping me figure this out, kind of,
Yeah.
and let it go, so that you can create space to write the thing you are supposed to write. Because I really believe if the story is in you, then somebody else wants to read it. But sometimes you got to figure out exactly how you're going to construct that story. And it can show up in so many different ways. It could be fiction. It could be nonfiction. It could be, if it's fiction, it could show up in all kinds of different fashions. So it still can feel like a challenge, though, when you think it's going to look like one path, and then maybe it's a different genre, or maybe it's a whole different thing you're going to tell. And you had to let go of a character, or you had to let go of certain scenes that really you thought were fantastic scenes. But
or you, in memoir, in my case, you had to make a big life change to really write your story.
Yeah.
Like, I had to make a big life change, because after my first edit, I was like, this is not my ending. And I knew it. My gut was telling me, And it was scary and it took a lot of strength and courage, but I had to make a big life change in order, and then it felt right. So it goes back to that gut instinct and listening to that, or that inner guide, or the universe, or God, or whatever it is that you believe in, because everybody has, a different belief, and that's okay. But yes, it's just getting quiet, giving yourself space, and letting that message, it's like, okay, this is not it, right? I'm struggling with this resistance is telling me something. Let me try a different road. Let me try a different path and see if there's less resistance there, and see if it flows better.
I love that, because that the thing that was coming to me was, so when you realized that the story was not, the story wasn't done yet, the
Yeah.
end, that wasn't the story, or that wasn't the ending, but then space had to occur, some time had to occur, and in order to get to that ending. But that could have meant space of writing or not writing, but really allowing and being uncomfortable with the uncomfortable. Oh
Mm-hmm.
my, that is,
Mm-hmm. Hard.
yes. So do you have any suggestions for someone who perhaps is in that transition, or is in their, maybe it's not necessarily what they've got the story, but maybe it's the transition between, are they going to get published with who they would like, or waiting for
Mm-hmm.
that agent or not, or working through the disappointments of rejection letter after rejection letter, to then realize, to just work through that in between phase that can feel a little frustrating at times.
Frustrating, and maybe also a little blow to our self-esteem, or at that point you start questioning, like, is my story even of interest? And I think you just have to go back to why you wrote that story to begin with. If you're kind of done with your story and you're struggling with that decision of, how do I publish it? Do I go down the hybrid? Do I go traditional? Do I self-publish? Again, I think it's try, but also it goes back to listening. And as you will probably write in the show notes, I'm also a life coach, or I call myself a transformative coach. And in coaching, what we do, and I didn't always do this in life, listen to our bodies. Really listen to what your body is telling you. And when you think about those different paths, where does it register in your body, and how does it register? Does it register very negatively, neutral, or is there a higher registration? We use the scale of a -10 to a +10. But so often we get into our heads and we try and think our way through something, and we step away from, how does it feel? How does this path feel to us? How does this decision feel to us? And how does this, and it may not be good to start with that. I mean, when I work with my clients, what I do is, like, start with, do I want tea or coffee for breakfast, right? And use what we call the body compass to, and so that way you get comfortable with it. But after you practice it for a little while, it's like, how does it feel to me? Does this feel like the right path for me? And that's the best advice and suggestion I would give future writers. And again, you got to give yourself some space to allow that, and without the noise and without other people, telling you what to do.
I love that so much. Laurie, this has been absolutely awesome. Thank you so, so much for this amazing and powerful conversation. Where can people connect with you, and where can they get sandwiched?
Thank you. People can connect with me on Facebook at Laurie James Author, or Instagram, Laurie James, and they can pick up my book Sandwiched at any retail bookstore. You're prefer independent, they can order it there, or you can pick it up on Amazon. And I believe that my 1 year anniversary of my book being published will be right around the corner. So
Oh, that
so
is so
excited.
exciting.
Yes.
Awesome.
My fifth
Congratulations.
baby.
That is awesome. Congratulations on
Fifth
your
one.
upcoming anniversary.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Laurie, thank you for making the time. This has just been awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Jen. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.